So good afternoon, everybody. I'm anwer. I'm a nuclear physicist working at the Legnaro National Laboratories of INFN in Italy. And today I will present you an open lecture on the question, is fundamental nuclear physics useful to society? So this lecture is part of my stay at the University of Warsaw in the framework of the integrated ZIP program. So when we speak about nuclear physics, the first thing we have to get an idea about is what is the scale at which we are working. So if we look at this picture, for example, we see the different scales. So in meters, so 1 corresponds to more or less the size that we are working. We speak about human and human activities. And if you go to the right, you will go to larger distances. So you will see the distance between the Earth and the Sun, for example, that corresponds to 200 billion kilometers. And then if you go further away, you will have the galaxy and all the observable universe. Nuclear physics has some implication on the physics in the galaxies and so on, but the scale at which we are really working is more on the opposite side. So below the human size, so you will see the red blood cells at the size of more or less a few micrometers. Okay, that a few micrometers, that corresponds to 10 to the minus 6. And if you go deeper into matter, you will see the atoms at some points that starts to appear at 10 to the minus 10, which corresponds to the angstrom. And then below at 10 to the minus 15, more or less, you will start to see, to focus on the atomic nuclei. So this red sphere inside the atom, that of course here on the graph, on the graphical representation is not at all at scale, but because it should be, as I said, 5 orders of magnitude smaller, and then you will see the nuclei. So when we speak about the study of the atomic nuclei, we are speaking mostly about the study of what they are made of. So we know since the early 1900s that they are made of protons and neutrons. Okay, and that those particles, contrary to what was thought at the time, are not fundamental particles, but are particles composed themselves of smaller particles, namely the quarks. But in the case of nuclear physics, this scale is not relevant. So then we are also interested to understand how do they interact with each other. So if you do a collision between two nuclei, what are the results that you will get? And finally, how they are formed. It can be in the universe or during interaction between nuclei. What are the shape of the nuclei? Why do they follow certain particular stuff, so certain particular behavior, and all of this is what we do in nuclear physics. So to study the nuclei, you need a probe. To study the probe, of course, has to be fine enough in order to see 10 to the minus 15 meters. Because you cannot see with a microscope an atom, for example. So this is because the visible light that is used generally in microscopes that are that are present in the biology lab for study, for example, of red blood cells, are using visible light, and the visible light has a wavelength between 400 and 700 and 800 nanometers, so 10 to the minus 7, which is below the dimension of the red cells, so you can see them, but it's way above the dimension of the protons and the atoms, so even 8 orders of magnitude above the proton. So we need a different probe But this can be obtained using properties of matter that has been understood from the point of view of quantum physics. That is the particle and wave aspects of the matter. So particle to a particle with a certain velocity can be associated a certain wavelength. So accelerating a particle allows to reduce the wavelength and thus probe smaller objects. So this has been explained by Louis de Broglie in the early 1900s. So how can we answer to the previous question? So about what are the nuclei made of and so on. So a common approach that is applied in many fields of physics is to send a projectile on what we want to study. So to break it, or for example, we can think of breaking the component into smaller parts in order to understand how it is made. Or we can also do scattering, so do some scattering reaction. So basically what we are doing is playing marbles with the atomic nuclei. So we will use a projectile in this case that is an atom, okay, an ion, that will be accelerated and sent on a different atom. So the two of them are atoms. So for example, if we denote the projectile as a little a and the target as capital A, these two will result in the formation of a compound nuclei or to a different final state. And what we want to do is to study exactly all those final states. So we want to measure if the nuclei will emit charged particles, so protons or alpha particles or neutrons, or if it will emit some radiation as it is shown here. So to do this, we need an accelerator. So here you have an example of the cyclotron that has been recently installed in the Linear National Laboratories that is made to accelerate protons, that you can find different accelerators. So for example, the cyclotron that is present in the AVIN laboratory of the University of Warsaw, that is located that is the next building close to the physics department, has also some dedicated cyclotron for AVINs and for protons and deuterons. So then the beam is transported through these pipes that you see here on the right of the pictures and focused by electromagnetic magnets and transported under vacuum down to the target. Then the beam is impinging, reaction is happening, and depending on what has to be measured, we will place a series of detectors all around the target. So here on the picture, you see, for example, some neutron detectors that have been placed, or different detectors for charged particle or for electromagnetic radiation. So one of the first thing that you can measure when you produce a nuclei is how this nuclei will decay. And I'm sure some of you have already seen this chart that is called the Segre chart, in which all the nuclei known are represented in function of their number of protons and number of neutrons. So generally, this map will be found in all the laboratories. So here I choose a color code that explains how the nuclei is decaying. So you will have in black the stable nuclei that are present in nature. In pinkish are the nuclei that are decaying by beta decay, so the transformation of a neutron in a proton. Blue is the transformation of a proton into a neutron. That are two different processes. And then you will see also some other process, such as the alpha decay. That was one of the first radioactivity observed in nature. And the fission, so for example, the fission of californium, uranium, and so on and so forth. And finally, if you focus more on the lighter nuclei, you will see that we have also another process that is here in orange, the emission of a proton, or in magenta, the emission of neutrons. So this corresponds to, in fact, a very important region of the chart and corresponds to the limit of existence of the nuclei. The emission of the proton and the neutrons is in fact due to the fact that those particles are not anymore bound to the nuclei. So the nuclei is not anymore a rigid ensemble that will decay or is stable, but it's something where the particles are not anymore bound to each other and will go away in a very, very short time. So generally, this map is found in the different lab, that some particular number of protons and neutrons have been marked. So you have some 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82 numbers that have been marked on this map that are numbers for which nuclei have specific properties. So this cannot be seen looking only on the way the nuclei are decaying, but we need additional information to understand what those numbers corresponds to. And for example, if we look not at the way they are decaying, but at the energy of the first excited states in nuclei having even number of protons and even number of neutrons, you see directly those lines appearing and corresponding to nuclei for which this excitation energy, so this first excited states, has a higher energy than the nuclei in the vicinity. Those nuclei are generally spherical nuclei that are quite difficult to excite because of this large energy gap between the ground state, so the level energy, excitation energy 0, and the first excited states. So this, of course, gives us some indication on the nuclear forces. So if the lecture was about nuclear physics, more into details, this will have some implication on the nuclear forces and will give us important information in order to develop a precise model that is able to describe the nuclei and their interaction with each other. It will also give us some indication about the origin of the nuclear force that we can see from the map and from other information that we can get. The next step that we can reach once we have a predictive model of the nuclei is to try to study the shape of the nuclei that will have influence, the shape and the properties of the nuclei that will have influence on how they interact with each other. So basically, if you have two spherical nuclei, okay, colliding with each other, the way they are interacting is different if you have two spherical one, or if you have one spherical with one that has a deformation such as a pier, as it is shown here, or as a football ball. So those have those shape and the importance of shape have some influence on how the nuclei are interacting. So for example, this is very important in order to understand how nuclei can be produced in nature. So we know that nuclei are produced, some light nuclei are produced in the stars, such as the sun, so doing fusion reaction, having hydrogen to hydrogen fusing until reaching carbons, magnesium, and so on, and so forth. But this kind of reaction is is very influenced by the structure of the nuclei. So for example, it is completely impossible to explain the abundance, so the proportion of carbon observed in the universe, without requiring that one particular state of the carbon-12, the most abundant carbon, exist. So this state was predicted by a nuclear physicist, Hoyle, and has since be measured. All those properties have been measured, but is a state with very, very specific properties. Okay. Then, on the structural point of view, then nuclear physics will also have some societal application and benefits, of course. So we will see in this lecture mostly the implication on biology and medicine and on cultural heritage. But those are not the only fields on which nuclear physics can have some implication. We'll have some implication on material science. So for example, you want to be able to test how the satellite that will be sent into orbits will behave under radiation. So you have to be sure before spending millions of euros to send a satellite that it will be able to resist to radiation. Then nuclear physics is useful for energy production. So with the nuclear power plant that are or fission, that is the most, or fusion, that will be maybe one of the technology of the future that is now being developed. Of course, nuclear physics, so the principle of nuclear physics are also useful for safety and national security, especially for the following all the radioactive isotopes that are produced by humankind. So first, I will focus now on the biology and medicine part.